Here we are, after almost 4 years of anticipation. The unknown journey continues. I remember playing Final Fantasy VII Remake back in 2020, sitting there as those credits rolled, giving a nice golf clap, thinking, that was pretty good. But I wondered and worried about the future of the trilogy, given the defined conclusion and changes made to the story. And I'll be honest, I was excited, but also a little nervous to see where they would take a game that is so beloved, so heavily impactful, and a story that is near and dear to many people's hearts, myself included. And man, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a phenomenal experience and is, in my opinion, the best Final Fantasy game that we have gotten since Final Fantasy X released back in 2001. Seriously, this game captures the lightning in a bottle that defined the beauty of Final Fantasy VII's original release, but it also understands the magic that makes a Final Fantasy experience so awe-inspiring, whether it is how the game continues to evolve on its real-time ATB system, marrying the real-time combat with its turn-based roots, the various regions of Gaia and the various activities and stories that transpire in these regions, or the laundry list of entertaining minigames that feel like they could be their own independent thing. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a magical experience, and one that, whilst it isn't perfect, is full of love, care, and magic that makes this experience a unique and unforgettable one. So, it goes without saying, before I dive into this review, I'm going to make sure that it is as spoiler free as possible. I will only be showing footage from the first 3 to 4 regions and story beats from the first 5 or so chapters. I will not be spoiling any of the major plot twists or turns in this game, and I will also be discussing some of the events of Remake. So if you are yet to play that game, I would urge you do so, because I might touch on some of the things happening in there and also in the original. So without further ado, let's get into my review for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So where better to start when discussing Rebirth than the story? And the story for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth picks up where 2020's Remake concluded, following the party's escape from Midgar. If there is one thing that I can say straight out the gate, it is don't believe his lies. Square stating that you can go into Rebirth with no knowledge of the original isn't entirely wrong, but it is far from the truth. You'll be able to follow this broad strokes story, and in many ways, structurally, Rebirth does tell the greatest hits of the original, but I feel that this remake trilogy definitely does shove a ton of fan service and plenty of references to the original and the external media here into Rebirth. I would look at Rebirth as something that complements the original, and as I've stated in my video for Remake, serves as a sequel more than an independent story. So I would say the short answer is yes. In many ways you can play this standalone, but I do believe that the weight and implication of many scenes and many relationships in this game will potentially be missed without having an understanding of key events and relationships that transpired in the original game. In terms of structure, it feels like Rebirth sits in this weird position where it simultaneously feels faithful to a large chunk of events that transpired in the original, whilst recontextualizing and throwing in their own twists and turns along the way. The story alone should run you about 40 to 50 hours to complete, with a wealth of side adventures and activities that I would highly recommend taking part in, as these do a great job at further fleshing out the world of Gaia and telling micro stories within this world. Yes, some of them are a mixed bag, which I will get to later on when discussing the side activities, but I do think that Rebirth does a better job at telling side stories here and fleshing out the world of Gaia and the story that Rebirth is trying to tell, but more on that later. As for the flow and pacing of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, whilst it's nowhere near as bloated as Remake, at times it feels like it rushes a few segments to get the story closer to the end destination. But at the same time, it does have a few different points that grind the player to a halt and require them to take part in a few side activities before progressing further. These things may frustrate some people. For me, I felt overall it didn't weigh down my overall experience, and ultimately, without diving deep into the details of the story, I felt like it was a real nostalgic trip down memory lane, and it felt like the journey I knew and loved from 97, as well as a new one that was able to surprise me. And As we all know with this series, it isn't a one-to-one remake. It does have the potential to surprise you, and for better or worse, it definitely will surprise you with many of the choices that have been made. I do believe that the choices made in this story will be up for debate as to whether they landed well or whether they are good or right choices, much like many of the decisions made for remakes changes. Rebirth will leave you with a lot of new questions and a lot of things up in the air that transpire throughout the game, which makes the wait for part 3 more agonizing. Much like what I said in my video for Remake, it's hard to fully determine the choices made here without seeing the trilogy to its full conclusion. There are still aspects of this experience that are left up for guessing, as it is incomplete currently. But based on the context of Rebirth alone, I do feel and think that most of the story is quite comprehensive, and personally, the narrative experience throughout the game was pretty great and I enjoyed it all the way up until its conclusion. Yes, there are still some questions that this game throws out there that are left unanswered, but I think that is a part of the charm of this experience, watching it slowly unravel and unfold. I know that this may serve as a point of annoyance for some people, and that's why I mention it, because much like Remake, Rebirth does go off the rails and deviate with its own story elements, which I personally don't dislike, and I do see potential with them being able to tell quite a clever reimagining and recontextualized Final Fantasy VII. I personally do believe that the story that they are trying to tell here is undeniably ambitious, and yes, it can go either way. It can be exceptional or it could be a shitfire, but only time will tell. And as for right now though, and what Rebirth offered me, I think that this is a pretty great experience with a lot of potential, albeit one that requires a lot of extensive knowledge on the universe of Final Fantasy VII to really understand what it's trying to pull at, and still a lot of convoluted elements that are left fully unexplained, but I think there is a lot here that can tie it all together and wrap it up neatly that part 3 can really deliver on, that'll make this story a truly phenomenal one that will, in its own way, live up and have its own legacy. It may not rival the original Final Fantasy VII, but nothing really ever could. No remake that's one-to-one or different could ever scale up to what that game was. But in its own identity and reimagining, the Final Fantasy VII Remake series could truly be something special, like how 7 was in '97, but it's in its own unique way to a new and familiar audience. And with that being said, the wait for Journey's End could not come any sooner. As I mentioned at the start of this video, the story segment was purely a spoiler-free discussion. I just wanted to let you know how I felt about the game in a broad sense, but I have a lot of thoughts on the finer details and I would love to get into them. So if you'd like to hear me chat or discuss that in more detail, I'd love to make a video discussing it. So let me know in the comments if you'd like to watch a video like that or be up for that. But anyway, back to the review. So now I would like to discuss the combat for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that core element, the moment-to-moment action that has clearly seen an evolution on what was established in Remake. The framework has evolved and seen the best blend of action and turn-based combat married together, and overall, what was established in Remake and is further evolved upon here in Rebirth is the best blend of that combat that we've seen in recent Final Fantasy entries. They take this evolution even further here, introducing 3 new playable characters that are Red 13, Yiffy, and Cait Sith, and each playstyle, much like the cast of characters in Remake, come with their own unique kit of abilities that makes approaching combat feel more versatile than it ever has, from the very core mechanics at play and the way that each of these individual characters operate. Many of the returning characters see their kit return in a similar function and fashion to how it was in Remake, with a lot more flexibility for aerial combat. There are also many other moving parts to the overarching combat of Final Fantasy VII that makes each encounter engaging, from assessing enemy weaknesses and more broadly figuring out other forms of weaknesses that could take down an opponent, from physical weaknesses and weak points that you could target on an enemy's body to different elemental effects, things that you've become familiar with if you've played Remake or are familiar with the Final Fantasy series. The stagger mechanic also does see a return here, and staggering foes is another way to deal heavy damage, much like how it was in Remake. It on the surface looks like some hack and slashy action game where you're just running and punching or slashing through your enemies, but deep below that surface is a sophisticated system that asks the player to remain strategic in their approach as you would in a turn-based experience. I'd argue that one of Remake's greatest strengths was its combat and how it worked to create imaginative boss encounters that would rework and reshape many of the iconic encounters that we found in the original game and repurpose them here and make a much more dynamic take on the combat and adapt it to the current combat model that we've seen here in Remake. And with Rebirth, they've doubled down on this and taken it one step further, whilst upping the ante in terms of spectacle whilst sustaining a strong focus on strategy. One of the ways that Square cleverly executes this is through a whole new dimension of combat called the synergy system or synergy attacks, which build on the foundations of synergy attacks that were introduced in the intermission expansion. There are two different types of synergy attacks here in Rebirth. One of those being a synergy skill and another being a synergy ability. So this synergy system serves as a team combo attack that the character you control in battle shares with another active party member. There are plenty that you can unlock throughout your playthrough through a new system called the folio system, which we'll talk about shortly. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two forms of synergy attacks. One, a synergy skill that operates as an additional ability that you can use with your teammates, similar to a weapon skill except it doesn't consume any ATB bars, and these skills can take different variations and playstyles. They can be offensive, defensive, or even provide support. How the synergy abilities work on the flip side is they work similar to a limit break, but more a co-op limit break, where two party members will deal a devastating attack and also cast a buff on the active party, such as breaking the ATB bar into 3 slots, or making all spells cost 0 MP for those party members for a duration of time. These abilities will offer a wealth of depth and really do, as the name suggests, urge you to think and synergize with your party accordingly for the best type of approach and the best results. And also makes you take the foe into account and their moves and being conscious of when to cast these abilities. It is nothing short of a clever system, and throughout my 80 plus hours with this game, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has done nothing but surprise me with its combat, enemy types, and boss encounters in particular, and I'm going to be really fascinated to play this on hard mode and see how it fares with the boss encounters and designs and what mechanics they really use to push my understanding of the system to its limits. On the flip side of the gameplay is the underlying gameplay systems that lock Rebirth into place, and I'm going to start with the progression for Rebirth, which I feel is insanely robust. It maintains the core foundations of its original counterpart, having the materia system that is flexible and enables plenty of player experimentation, but also has a broader net of abilities with the weapon proficiency system that was introduced in Remake, making a return here, but a much larger pool of weapons that can be acquired for a much more robust party. I absolutely love the different weapons that you could find here in Rebirth, solely for the new abilities that you'd acquire. The system for leveling up the weapons themselves has been simplified here in Rebirth, where there is no longer this Crystarium style level system that was found in Remake, but instead each character's weapons have a level that is assigned to them, and you can select a pre-assigned amount of abilities for each weapon and tailor it to fit a certain sort of playstyle, and as your weapon level increases throughout the game, you'll be able to equip more abilities. I really do like this system. I think that the system in Remake was needlessly robust with too many different abilities that were just nothing more than stat increases, but here in Rebirth I really do feel like whilst it is somewhat similar, having a much smaller pool of those abilities and stats that feel like they make a meaningful difference, it does feel like you are able to mix and match those stats similar to materia and design a certain sort of playstyle and modify it on the go. Rebirth also sees the inclusion of a new skill tree progression system that is set for each single party member called a folio. The skill points acquired throughout your playthrough are used to unlock abilities in each character's specific folio tree, providing individual upgrades, unlocking different synergy skills and abilities, and even new limit breaks. The folio skill tree feels like it provides a good mix of individual character upgrades and team upgrades, and Most of all, the progression here does feel mostly meaningful, providing particular abilities that can provide a 0 MP cast for particular abilities and increase the amount of damage you do, or going into a battle with a certain ability active or having a chance for that to occur, alongside, yes, the synergy skills, limit breaks, and all these other big meaningful upgrades. It does feel like this system is always providing you a reason to check back and upgrade something. And this system and the overall progression of the folio tree itself expands the more you upgrade the party level, which looks familiar and works in a similar fashion to how you upgrade your weapons and the weapon level. But it's more broadly speaking for your party and how it trickles into each party member. You'll get party XP from completing various side activities and world intel. These are your big activities that'll populate the world and give you stuff to do, which we will discuss more in depth shortly, but it makes doing these activities and completing the various tasks that you find in Gaia feel very rewarding here. And the folio system in of itself feels like a much more fleshed out, meaningful, and rewarding skill tree that I've seen in recent years, and I think that they've executed it really well here in Rebirth. The final new system that I would really like to touch on that I feel seeps into a lot of the story in this game is this new system that they've introduced referred to as Bonds of Friendship, which provides more intimate scenes between Cloud and the various party members. It provides special moments between many of the cast and characters and does allow you to get to know them and know their struggles, who they are, and on a much more deeper level that yes, the main story does tell, but this gives you a more personal attachment and connection with them. And yes, the original did have this hidden system with points to see who you'd get that special date with or who you'd connect with more with like the dialogue choices that you made as Cloud, but I feel like they've doubled down and really fleshed this out incredibly well here in Rebirth, providing unique little activities that you can do with each party member that strengthens your friendship. These special dialogue choices that you can pick during select moments in the story that also does heighten those different relationships with particular characters. They can also be denoted by the smiley faces over their head to show you where those relationships are at, and it also does feed in really well with the various systems that I've discussed in this game and will continue to talk about. One of them being the synergy system, because as you synergize with different party members and learn new abilities together, it will also strengthen and improve your relationship. And not only that, but the quests that you do throughout this game will be character specific, so you might be going on a journey with Tifa or Aerith or Barrett and learning about their various struggles or something that is near and dear to them and going on a quest and getting to know them better, and that in turn will strengthen that relationship along with the rewards that the quest itself gives you. So there's a lot of interesting payoffs here in getting to know these characters better that is seeped into every facet of this gameplay system, from its synergy and combat to the more side quests and exploration structure. And I think that they've done a really good job here, and I'd love to see how they continue to expand upon it going forward into part 3. The closest comparison that I can really think of here is the heart-to-heart moments in the Xenoblade series, where you have a offhand conversation with a different party member and you get to know them on a deeper level. But I would say that what distinguishes FF7 Rebirth is how closely they try to tie these into the story and the more cinematic approach of the way that Rebirth handles these moments too. There's also some implications that some of these may have with various moments as well, making the choices and who you choose to prioritize have some implications that I won't spoil. Overall, it feels like all different forms of progression and the systems here in Rebirth really do feed into the exploration and combat exceptionally well. It makes everything that you're doing feel rewarding, whether you're trying to level up your folio system, whether you're trying to progress your weapons and unlock new abilities, or whether you're trying to deepen your relationships with the various party members and get to know them better. There is so much there to engage with in this game that really does lengthen it out in a way that feels like it is rewarding. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth kicks off with the party members escaping the city of Midgar and setting out into the world of Gaia, and we'll see you visiting many of the iconic areas that were found in the original game, with some optional areas becoming more of a main course here. These different areas are divided into regions, and the environments for each region feel like it strikes the right balance between landmass to explore and activities to complete. So, what activities are there that occupy these regions? Well, they are a blend of open world map marked staples that you've seen before, like the towers which reveal other objectives, defeating marked enemies, or scanning different life springs. Whilst they are nothing new in their structure or concept, it is how they are handled here in Rebirth that feels nice, as many of these different quests lead to some interesting discoveries and activities themselves that flesh out the region you're exploring, from the ecology, ancient relics, and the Moogles that are in need. There is also one form of quest which is quite unique in its form in each region, known as a proto-relic, and I highly urge you to complete all of them. I had likened the open world in Rebirth in terms of its structure and design to something like Ghosts of Tsushima actually, and what I mean by this is that the formula and the way that FF7 Rebirth conducts its open world, providing a map marker driven open world that's full of activities and collectibles, it isn't new in terms of the activities themselves, but it is the combat, the world, and the modes of traversal in between these activities, along with the surprises and just getting lost in the environment that make it so worthwhile. Rebirth's open world activities don't reinvent the wheel or innovate in a crazy way that pushes open worlds forward, but in my opinion it never really needed to. It just needed to recapture the magic of exploring the world of Gaia, and that is something that I think Square have been able to pull off extremely well here in Rebirth. One thing that I really do like here in Rebirth is how traversal of each region is handled, and is a main driver and is something that's put at the forefront of the exploration, providing a diverse and unique range of different chocobos that have their unique abilities that provide the player and the party to progress and explore the open world in a plethora of different ways, whether it's climbing mountains, gliding the skies, or traversing the sea. These different abilities break up each location and make it feel distinct and interesting with its own personality. It's not just the biomes and the music that plays that makes each location feel so vivid, but also how you traverse and the quests that occupy these places. There is so much uniqueness that breaks up each individual zone, and that is what I think Square have been able to cleverly do with crafting the open world here in Rebirth. There's also these cute baby chocobos that lead you to rest points that also remind me of the foxes from Ghost of Tsushima, another correlation there, and for those who like patting things, yes, you can pat those baby chocobos. There is a large variety of content that can take up your time here in Rebirth, but if there is one questline or side content that I'd highly recommend that I've mentioned multiple times in this video, it would be the proto-relics. They occupy each region, they tell their own unique stories, provide their own unique spin on each particular story, and are seriously worth your time. I don't want to say any more because saying more would rob you of that experience, and I do not wish to do that, but trust me on that, check out the proto-relics. So now that we've discussed the world intel, I would like to dive into the side quests that make a return here in Rebirth, and they follow a similar structure to how they were presented in Remake. They serve a much more meaningful point here, fleshing out the different cities and districts that you'll explore. The quests, in terms of the stories and structure, are a mixed bag. Some tell some interesting stories, some humorous stories, and honestly, the quests themselves in terms of their structure are quite mundane in what they get you to do. But seriously, it's the conversations and the banter amongst the party members that makes some of these feel worthwhile. An example for me was I legit did an escort mission, which generally they're not that fun really, and I was guiding a dog from point A to point B, and I know that sounds like a played out quest in its design, and yeah, sure, you aren't wrong. But what made this seemingly simple quest so memorable is the conversations between the characters along the way, the addictive combat that broke up the minutiae of the escort mission, the lush landscapes, and just looking for an excuse to continue to explore the various regions of Gaia. The quest itself had this extra level of charm just because of getting to see the party members engage with each other, discuss what the theme of the quest was trying to portray, and it took this seemingly mundane and bland quest and gave it a bit more charm. Yes, the quest itself is still in its design not that special, but it had this special little charm to it, at least for me. Personally, to me, the side quests, when at their best, felt on par with those filler chapters that we'd find in Remake, and to be honest, as side quests, I do prefer that. Like I said earlier as well, many of those quests also tie in to one of your party members, giving you the opportunity to spend more time with them and get to know them alongside with the world and the people of the various regions. If there is one thing that it feels the remake tried to convey from the original, it would be the struggle between the people living in the slums versus the people living on the top plate. It is trying to convey the plague and the stranglehold that Shinra has on Midgar. Here in Rebirth, what the world, intel, and the side quests are trying to convey is the world, the nature, the contrast to the steel circular city that kicks off the remake and the original game, and understanding the planet that you are exploring and the different societies that occupy and live in this world, and the nature itself that lives in tandem with the people. It is something that I think the original did a really good job at conveying whilst you explored this game, and I feel like Rebirth, in its own different way, did a really good job at conveying it through the various different forms of side material that you will find in this game. Okay, so we've talked about the open world, the side quests, and the world of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but there is one last major component that I've left out up until now, and that is of course the minigames. And man, some of these minigames are so competent in their foundations that they could be their own standalone game. These minigames are full of such charm and personality and really bring to life that wonder that really does just encapsulate the Final Fantasy experience, particularly 7. It's important to consider these minigames and understand that these are also reimaginings of many of the minigames that we've seen in the original Final Fantasy VII, along with a plethora of new minigames that are distinct with their own mechanics and rewards, giving you a reason to explore the hubs of each particular region. There was so much here that just brings these various hubs to life and each location to life in a way that's more lively than Remake. Whilst I do feel that some may find there are too many minigames, to me I felt that the minigames, particularly the story ones in Rebirth, capture the magic of that PS1 era of Final Fantasy games, and also a reminder of that PS1/PS2 era of gaming. The minigames here in Rebirth feel like they break up the more serious moments of the story with lighthearted stop-off points, but with a visual flair and control mapping that follows more modern conventions, and I felt weirdly nostalgic playing through the different minigames in Rebirth. And I know for some that these minigames, particularly the story ones, may feel like they grind the game to a halt and break up the pacing, and I can understand that from a particular perspective, especially playing the game for the first time, but I do feel like many of these stop-off points, in retrospect, do provide a good sense of getting to connect with many of the different characters and just have those moments of joy that also contrast very well with the more serious moments that play out throughout the game. Overall, one of my criticisms, and I think for many, was with Remake that there was a lack of things to really do and bring the open world to life. Here in Rebirth, I think they've doubled down on it in every single regard, from exploration to the minigames to the questing. There is something for everyone really, and there is so much in abundance that it just feels like it can almost be overwhelming. And for the most part, I feel that most of the content in all these departments is satisfactory to excellent. And I think that if they continue with this formula going forward into the third game and continue to evolve it, that we will have something truly special on our hands, because the open world aspects of Rebirth were truly a standout for me. But there is one minigame in particular that deserves its own little slot here in this review, and that is none other than Queen's Blood. It has its own unique side quests and its own plethora of challenges that you can face off and battle in this new addictive card game that is just really comprehensive to understand. And you know, at first it might feel like it's a bit daunting, but once you get the hang of it and get in the flow of it, it's truly an addictive game, and you'll be battling your way through anyone at any major city or even little town that you find. And yes, there are ranks, there's like a whole league that you're going through, and this questline does pay off. There is so much there that's just worth seeing, and so many people worth battling. There's cards that you collect from winning battles, you can buy card packs. It's this whole other aspect of the game that is just running in tandem with the main story, and it just feels like it hits every note here so well. There is just so much in this minigame alone that is just full of love and charm. And honestly, if one of the biggest critiques that I had of Final Fantasy XVI, and hell, even Remake to an extent, is the lack of meaningful activities that occupy the hubs, the towns of the open world. And I don't just mean through quests, but like even these fun activities, these little detours. Queen's Blood took up tons of hours of my time in Rebirth, not just because it was a nice distraction, but also because it was an addictive minigame, and one that in its roots and foundation could even serve as its own standalone game, similarly to something like Gwent in The Witcher. Seriously, there is So much love and depth that is put into this one minigame alone, and the fact that they went there with this narrative thread too and were able to just go all in on this, and it plays in conjunction with many different challenges wanting to face you in these different regions and the ranks as you climb and progress. It's just, there is so much here to really just enjoy in this one aspect of the game alone. It is such a stellar minigame, and it's just insane just how much love and care was put into this and placed into every facet of this minigame, and more broadly speaking, the minigames at large. It is just a testament to the effort and love that has been put into the open world aspects of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and it is something that has really just, I've had to sit with and process just how much love in this game has really been put into every single aspect. And I think that is one thing that I find truly endearing about this game, because whether you end up loving or hating this game, you can't deny that a ton of love and effort has been put in here with every single facet of the game. Whether it lands for you is a different story, but for me, I think that Rebirth really has done an excellent job at conveying the charm of a Final Fantasy game, and more importantly, the world of Final Fantasy VII. Now I'd like to talk about the overall presentation for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, primarily the visuals and sound. And man, the soundtrack for Rebirth is phenomenal. Seeing the return of the dynamic soundtrack which they were introduced in Remake, it plays so many different variants of the iconic tracks that Nobuo Uematsu made back in '97, and he has come back here to recompose and recontextualize many of these songs to be rebuilt for when you are in or out of combat or experiencing different parts of the story. The ways that many of the iconic tracks from the original game have been recomposed here in Rebirth and reused really does just land and sell the atmosphere, the pivotal moments, and the sense of freedom and exploration that Rebirth gives you in this experience. Is absolutely insane. The main theme of Final Fantasy VII has never felt so varied and distinct, and it is just incredible to hear many of these different regional themes further create this unique sense of presence that I was talking about in the open world segment of this review. It really does just sell that sense of place, connection to the environment, and your presence within the world. The acting performances from the various cast members here are great as well, and so many of these impactful moments landed quite well for me because of it. I do feel that the writing itself at some points could be a tad cheesy at times, but all the performances themselves handled this really well. I think Cody Christian's role as Cloud really did shine a lot more here in Rebirth, with us getting to slowly see more sides of the character Cloud, as Remake's Cloud still hadn't really opened up, come out of his shell, and we get to see more of this character come to life here in this game, and I think his performance was really a standout. Some other show-stealing roles was Susie Young's role as Yuffie and John Eric Bentley's role as Barrett. Whenever these characters were on screen, I was just keen for whatever shenanigans would transpire. Every line of dialogue was just like, it either make me chuckle or laugh or just feel something, and all of the main cast and even supporting characters just nailed their roles extremely well. Alongside this beautifully crafted soundtrack and vocal performances is also the visual splendor that depicts the world of Gaia, and it feels so incredible. And one big thing that I want to try and sell in this review is the sense of scale, and again, the character's place within the world. It is so deeply felt here. One obvious example that I can point to is the canon city of Junon and that sense of scale and presence that it has within that Junon region. It is inescapable, even from afar. It is just there, so monolithic, huge, and it is just absolutely incredible and really just paint this vivid picture of its presence within the region and the sense of scale of your character within it. The variation of these different locations that you visit make up a curated world of Gaia that Square has decided to showcase here in Rebirth, and really are nothing short of a testament to how beautifully envisioned this world of Final Fantasy VII was back in '97 when it was originally built, and how brilliantly reconstructed it has been and brought to life here in Rebirth. It makes me hope for the return of many of these places in Part 3, and for Square to bring the rest of this incredible world to life. On the visual/performance side of things, I felt the lighting would sometimes make some of the character models look a little weird and downright scary at times with how the light would reflect off them, and there is also a known issue as well with the blur that would occur in performance mode. Thankfully, Square have addressed that they're currently working on a patch for these issues, so hopefully in the coming weeks to a month this should be a non-issue, but I still thought it was something worth mentioning just as a buyer beware. Overall, ultimately, I loved every aspect of presentation here in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I thought the soundtrack and the different variants of many different songs that we know and love, the iconic ones, as well as the new additions and new songs that they've thrown into this game, were simply incredible. I thought that the reprised roles that took place in Remake, as well as the new cast and new members and new characters, did a stellar job and provided a level of charming and endearing personality to many of the characters that we know and love. It really did capture the Final Fantasy experience that we had back in 97 with these characters, but it told it in a more cinematic way, which is kind of interesting considering how cinematic the original was for its time. It felt like each location you visited, enemy you encountered, or side activity that you took part in was faithfully redesigned to recapture that magic and essence of what made the lands of Gaia so magical to explore decades ago. And in terms of the music and environments, I really do believe that this is the aspect, the icing on the cake, the thing that really does sell the open world and the experience of FF7 Rebirth. So to bring this lengthy review to a close, I absolutely loved my time with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and as someone who had reservations for this entry, particularly after the narrative hooks that closed out Remake, I am surprised with how well almost all aspects of this game sat with me. Yes, its narrative undeniably is convoluted at times, and honestly, for those with no experience of the original game, navigating this remake could be quite a challenge. But in terms of narrative changes, I don't feel that they in any way ruined the original game, and I feel with new context of this remake, they have the potential to really land and hit us in a whole new way, just as the 1997 release did decades ago. The Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy was never meant to be a replacement, but a complement to the original. And as a video game, I feel Rebirth makes good on all the elements of what Final Fantasy VII was trying to be, and having played the remake again recently, and just recently finishing Rebirth, I've come to the realization that I do love this re-trilogy, and it's not because it is the original, or it's better than the original, or that it even matches up in the identity of what the original was. It's quite the opposite, actually. It's its own identity. Much like how I love and adore the original game, and it's one of my favorite games, I feel that the re-trilogy in its own unique way really does capture that similar magic, but in a whole new different perspective. And even if part 3 narratively doesn't deliver the answers and the conclusion that I was expecting and hoping for, it can't take away from the experience and the memories that I've had with Rebirth. Because simply put, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a love letter to Final Fantasy VII, its legacy, and it is more broadly a reminder to us what makes the Final Fantasy series so special at its core, and more broadly, what the magic is that we felt with 7 all those years ago. It may not hit the same narrative beats, or for some the narrative highs that 7 laid out all those years ago, but in its own unique way and its own identity that parallels and mirrors this story and these characters, it really does bring to life a whole new different adventure, and I love it for that. And I think ultimately, if you are able to look past the comparisons between the original and take this new unknown journey for what it is and walk that new path, you might find, and you will find, some level of enjoyment with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, because for me, it really does perfectly articulate what I love about Final Fantasy and more broadly FF7, and the wait for Journey's End could not come sooner. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.